Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. I am Surbhi Gupta, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. India's press has had a long and proud history, which played a key role in its struggle for freedom from its British colonizers. Even today, its media landscape is as diverse and multifaceted as the country in which it operates. While journalists have always been at risk for speaking truth to power, over the last decade, since the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP came to power in 2014, observers have begun to warn of an alarming trend that is preventing journalists within India from being able to do their job properly, and in some cases is even putting their lives at risk. Earlier this week, Indian authorities ordered the Caravan magazine to take down a story on the alleged torture and murder of civilians in Jammu by the army. Last week, senior journalist Nikhil Vagle's car was attacked in Pune, allegedly by workers from the BJP, after Vagle criticized a senior BJP leader. A few weeks before, a French political reporter based in Delhi since 2001 received a formal notice from authorities to surrender her residence permit. Indian authorities are also prosecuting some of them under counterterrorism and sedition laws. When India fell to 161st place on the Press Freedom Index last year, the reason given was violence against journalists, the politically partisan media, and the concentration of media ownership. Many TV news channels in India have turned into government mouthpieces, and pressure is mounting on others to toe the line. There are only a few publications and journalists that are engaged in keeping the media and the government accountable. I sat down recently with two of these journalists, Manisha Pande and Samar Halarnkar, who joined me from Delhi and Bangalore, respectively. Manisha is the managing editor at Newslaundry, a media watchdog in India. She also hosts and writes TV Nuisance, a satirical show that looks at TV news in India. Summer is a veteran journalist and editor who recently founded Article 14, an independent news publication in India, which has published some groundbreaking reporting from the country. Great. So thank you for being here, Summer and Manisha. I think so. I would like to start the conversation by asking. So there have been multiple reports in the recent past. We've seen about how threats against journalists in India have been increasing. That India ranks 161 out of the 180 countries on the Media Freedom Index, and how the space to do like independent and critical journalism is decreasing. So could you tell me more about what are the kind of challenges that are being faced by journalists in India, and where are these threats usually coming from?
The first thing that I think which is very glaring about the Indian media landscape right now is that there's a very complete and near total capture of mainstream voices, especially the loudest voices, the most prominent voices, and voices that are heard the most, which is television news. So if you switch on television news in India today, it's pretty much, same propaganda across channels. So there's an absolute and total capture of mainstream television news channels, Hindi and English. These are most read, these are most viewed. They have the maximum impact. So not many people may tune into English news, but it has a lot of impact when it comes to policy, narrative. And of course, then you have Hindi news, which is consumed by a large section of Indians. And it is not an exaggeration to say that when you turn on the television today, it's very close to what you see in non-democracies like Russia, or we joke that it's North Korean level sometimes. The kind of praises that you'll hear about the prime minister, the kind of feats that you're told, he's achieving day in and day out without much data, and so you have that. And you have mainstream newspapers that are operating in considerable constraints. A, because much of news in India, much of media in India is dependent on government advertising. That is really the core of where they're making their money from. There's corporate advertising, but government advertising is, has is a large chunk of how they're making their revenues. So you have had examples of, say, for the Hindu, which is an English language paper, does a story on Rafale, which is a story on a series of, if not corruption, but opacity around the deal, questions around the deal. The Hindu had that prominently, and they had their ads cut off. We know anecdotally of how your ads can just be snapped like this if there isn't a favorable coverage in a particular newspaper. And then you have digital news ecosystem, which is small, it's nimble. I think most organizations, are still small when you compare them to big television or news organizations. And you had a series of government action on a lot of the digital independent news organizations that aren't necessarily dependent on advertising. So a lot of them can be freer in their coverage. A lot of them are subscription based. Some take donations, some are not profit, but allows them a certain degree of freedom in which, in how they question the government, report on the government, or even analysis and critique. And those entities have come under pressure through direct government action. You've had raids. So, for example, Newslaundry has had something called the income tax surveys. Can't call them raids, but they are surveys. You have notices every day that come in and you have to respond to them. Everything may be by the book, but you can just be, caught in this whole paperwork and this legal work that you get embroiled in. You've had very recently NewsClick, whose founder, has been jailed under terrorism charges. He's currently in jail. And then, of course, you have FIRs, multiple FIRs that organizations have to tackle. This could be for a report they did. This could be because somebody was offended by what they've said, hurting religious sentiments or stuff like that. And I think almost every digital news organization has a couple of FIRs from a couple of states filed against their reporters that they're fighting. So that is really the landscape that we're talking about. Um, I think of course, there's been cases like Gauri Lankesh. Uh, but to me, I think the big issue is not a threat, a real physical threat. Say, being a journalist in Afghanistan, I think is very different, and there's no comparison. It's just way more difficult, way more of a threat to you physically than being in India. But the big problems here are this kind of a silent censorship that's creeping in upon everyone, and there's a silent sort of a message that goes around that if you do a certain thing, it's going to have repercussions with your business or your very existence of being able to do something.
Summer, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to say that in more than 30, I think 34 years now that I've been a journalist, I have never felt as acutely a sense of threat as I do today. There are a lot of colleagues and friends who are facing, as Manisha said, criminal cases, of course, but more than that, who have been locked up on the flimsiest of charges, on non existent charges. It doesn't really matter what those charges are because the fact is in India, the judicial process is the punishment. So many of them are first interned and then the trial unfolds, and the trial may take years. So there are lots of people who are facing that. Many of those who have come out, of course, have come out after courts have said there isn't a crime here at all, and yet they were locked up for 2 years, 3 years, etc. Nowhere more so than in Jammu and Kashmir. Elsewhere, of course, but I think all of these tactics to intimidate the media have been tried first in Jammu and Kashmir and then taken to the rest of India. It's reached a stage now where I think all of us are very aware that there could be a knock on the door, on our doors. At Article 14, where I work, I think we're just lucky that we haven't, well, I'd say yet had any government action. But most other independent media of any consequence have faced some kind of government action or the other, action that is more well suited to an autocracy rather than the mother of democracy, which is what our prime minister often describes us. I just want to say that there is a big gulf between public perception of how the media exist in India and the reality. I'll just give an example. I was at a dinner a couple of weeks ago when I met a college friend after many years, and he asked what I was doing and how it was going. I gave him the usual spiel of what we know and what we perceive of a profession under threat and how there was little future unless you allied with the government. So he appeared very doubtful. He said, "Wasn't it always like that?" So I just stared at him. I said, maybe he's one of those fanatic government supporters. So I gave a further spiel about how, no one ever went to jail for mocking Manmohan Singh, the previous prime minister. And he appeared convinced. He said, but tell me, were Priyanka and Rahul Gandhi not compromising our security by talking to China? He was referring to some random, WhatsApp forwards that had been put out by government supporters and the government. And what that indicated was that the power of WhatsApp and fake news is immense. It squirrels itself into the mind's recesses and magically emerges whenever faced with logic and fact. So I explained to him. I'm just taking this one example because the Chinese have made substantial inroads into Indian territory over the last few years and have kind of salami sliced about nearly 2,000 square kilometers of territory. So I told him how that had happened, how we had lost territory, and the prime minister had blatantly said that no such thing had happened, which has now turns out to be, well, patently a lie. So his eyes widened and he said, no one explained it like this to me before. The media never reports things like this. So that is the kind of, that is, in general, the kind of approach that many people have towards the mass media. They choose to believe what they want to believe. And the more educated are more misinformed than those who are not as educated, which makes it even more troubling. And I'm of course stared at this friend of mine because I was caught off guard by his naivete. And soon I was fielding questions from somebody else listening in about what's the real story here and what's the real story there. And I was talking to very well-educated people, but their cluelessness about current events was apparent. They did not display strong biases and were open to debate, but they were clearly subsumed by this fog of misinformation around them.
I think it's a very interesting point that Samar has brought up, and I just want to underscore this because, like I said, there's a mainstream media capture of television news channels, and for an audience in America, it's best way to explain these channels is as a Fox News but on acid, and we have 5 or 6 of them, not one. And when there's government action against independent journalists, say the NewsClick case, or when the BBC was raided by the Indian government, these channels celebrated it and said it's great that these guys need to be taught a lesson. Like Samar gives the example of a friend asking, that didn't they compromise the security with regard to China? This is the narrative that you're watching every day on television news channels. It is pretty much the voice of the government in India. I don't make a distinction. And they'll say that these Chinese agents have been put in place. NYT is routinely abused as this foreign menacing hand that is trying to destabilize India. BBC must be put in their position. Washington Post journalists should be taught a lesson. So there's an active kind of frenzy being whipped up every day on primetime debates in India, which is, it's peculiar because it's anti-journalism. The conversation is, how do we teach these guys a lesson? you know they should be put in jail, they should be taught a lesson. These are anti-national, these are terrorists, they're anti-India, they're destabilizing us. So I sometimes don't blame people for the way they think because that's just what they're watching.
So if you could tell me more, like, tell us more about what is the state of TV news and news shows in India? Like, what are the kind of things they talk about? Like a little bit more, so that we could get a sense.
So, look, hyperpartisanship has always been a problem in Indian television news. It's the model because talk sells. There's very little focus on reporting. It works when at 9 p.m. you have a foreign against. So that's not new. Uh, Partisanship, sorry, not hyperpartisanship. Partisanship hasn't always been normal, but what we've seen since 2014 is hyperpartisanship. And the show that I started, the idea to it came to us around 2016 because up till then we had been critiquing the media. You had sensationalism, trial by media. You'd have the standard, who's an anti-national, who is a nationalist, stand up for the national anthem, kind of stuff happening. But I think 2016 there was a marked shift where anchors started asking for the jailing and of activists or voices or dissenters that weren't in line with the current government. So you have very actively anti-people media. And we'd been writing about it, and I thought, okay, we have to have a response which is in their language. So doing a video show, taking it head on, using satire, because I think you can get through to a lot of people if you use satire and humor rather than preach, be in this preachy mode all the time. So what we've seen, at least in the last 4 years, 2016 onwards, is that it's not just about being pro government or pro Prime Minister Modi. It is actively anti people. So if there's a protest, there are questions asked. A regular protest of women, Muslim women sitting, doing a peaceful protest on a citizenship law that was supposed to be coming. That kind of a protest would be dubbed anti-national on the payrolls of Pakistan. A link from the Pakistan, or are they planning some terror, attack? We had the farmers protest, again the same thing. You have a frenzy in the media questioning them, that, and not just questioning them, but saying that they have terrorist links. And due to such, you've also had instances where you've had activists jailed after television news has whipped up a frenzy of calling them anti-nationals, Maoists, Naxals, extremists, left-wing extremists. You've had people slapped with terror charges. In fact, one of the young activists who's been in jail now for almost 3 years, a Muslim guy, Omar Khalid, he calls for a peaceful protest and he gets slapped with terror charges. But the frenzy around that case is whipped up on television news, labeling him a terrorist again and again, to such a point that today if you go and talk to regular people on the street, they will be convinced that there's something wrong with this guy. He's probably on the payrolls of Pakistan, or he's a terrorist. So you've had a anti-people media very clearly asking for jailing of people, slapping them with terror charges, and you've had a very real impact of that, where you've seen people being tried on terror charges, and a, a real kind of hate for minorities, which I think sometimes even the principal party in power would shy away from, the kind of things that anchors can sometimes say. So every day you're being told how your life is in danger. The majority population, Hindus, are in danger because Muslims are out to you know marry your women, or they'll spit on your food. We actually had a primetime show which spoke of a conspiracy that Muslims are somehow spitting on food, Muslim vendors, so attacking businesses. A Muslim restaurant owner is suspect because he may be spitting on food. I mean, it's atrocious to even say that, but this is primetime news that people are consuming. All kinds of jihad, love jihad, which is that Muslims are out to woo Hindu women, and fool them and marry them. Uh, Land jihad, that they're out to grab your land. Food, like I said, So every day you're being told how the Muslim is out to get you. And there's some or the other jihad being waged against the majority population. And often there's like zero evidence to any of this. There's not even a criminal case that can support, most of these conspiracy theories.
But what do you think is the motivation for them to do so? Like to say such things and have such content on their TV channels? Is it because it's selling? There is demand for it.
I would only like to say that there is this is all part of what I would call a slow, great process of de-democratization in India. And it's not limited only to the media. And obviously, what's happening to the media is an indication of the de-democratization. And this de-democratization has been aided and approved by vast swaths of the media, as Manisha said, the opposition, the administration, and the Indian people themselves, really, in accepting all this. Some of this began some time ago, including under successive Congress governments who deliberately allowed India's democracy to be clouded by the continuation and deployment of many laws, old and new, that essentially were meant not to be used in a democracy, but by a ruler against the ruled. So there was no complaint, and no significant complaint, and certainly not enough media coverage when thousands have suffered under wrongful use of vaguely worded laws against terrorism, for criminal defamation, the misuse of information technology, and sedition. And sedition, for example, has been used freely over the years against sloganeering students, villagers protesting power plants, cartoonists, all kinds of people. Thousands this has been used against. And there hasn't been enough coverage or complaint when thousands have been put in jail without trial. Kashmiri rioters, tribals who happen to get in the way of security sleeps, wrongly accused terror suspects, mostly Muslims, and human rights workers. There was no complaint about police and torture methods that alienated many more than they convicted, about courts that were gradually corrupted and compromised, and about media increasingly beholden to power instead of questioning it. Now, what has happened, I think, is that the advent of social media has greatly accelerated the process of the progression of de-democratization. Narendra Modi and his, Hindutva hordes have weaponized these media, and they've successfully urged millions of Indians to, I would say, embrace the dark side. So many people are self-radicalized, believing every bit of this fake news that Manisha referred to, and that turns them against their neighbors and friends. And in doing so, I'm afraid they confirm that a large part of this country is willing to be led away from, justice and democracy, and into this growing uncharted darkness. I'm just trying to give you a larger perspective of what I think is happening to Indian media and and democracy in general.
Yeah, and I mean, why does it sell, to your question? I think, I mean, there's just two things that I can think of. One is that, look, there's a very clear understanding that certain sort of behavior as a journalist will give you access, will give you prominence, and will help you rise in your career. Today, if you're in a mainstream news television organization, you do an investigative story on the number of jobs promised versus what's really happened on the ground, you may lose your job, or you may be fired, or that story may be killed. But if you are a primetime anchor that can whip up a Hindu versus Muslim debate every night, you may get an interview with the prime minister. Mr. Modi has not given a press conference, in India for the past 10 years. He does not like to take questions from the press, which is quite alarming. But he does give one-on-one interviews. And if you look at the choice of journalists that he speaks to one-on-one, these are the same guys that every day, do Hindu Muslim, uh, suck up to the government, peddle the kind of hate stories that I spoke about, love jihad, land jihad, stuff like that. So there's a clear understanding that you can rise up in today's ecosystem by doing news which is hyper nationalist and Hindutva on steroids, basically. Um, so I think, I mean, it's just a clear path to glory in Indian television space. If you do that kind of news. Although there's been some surveys, the CSDS comes out with routine surveys, and the Indian people actually seem to be more discerning when it comes to what they've been uh, consuming. Because I remember reading a data set that said that even the BJP supporters felt that the news was too pro Modi. So there's some understanding even among news consumers that, okay, what we're watching is at least some. I'm not sure. I mean, we don't have robust data, but I think even people get that, some of it is just hyper nationalist propaganda.
Right, and there were also laws that were introduced recently, right, which could have helped the government censor news content online and, like, I think make internet shutdown easier. So, if you could tell us more about that, like how has that impacted workings of, like, in at your own organizations or elsewhere? How is what are these new laws and how have they impacted?
There are three or four laws that the government has. One of them was passed by Parliament, in a Parliament which had kicked out 95 of its MPs and went ahead and passed it immediately, which was, I think, the new telecommunications bill. But if you look at these laws, what they do essentially is that they give the government power to, they're very vague and they're very broad. And they give the government power to selectively censor any kind of news content, shut down the internet anytime they want, intercept personal and other communications. Everyone from YouTubers to individual journalists to columnists, anyone can be shut down and taken offline. And we're seeing that happen, in fact, more and more. There was a television channel in Maharashtra which had run I think a sex tape or something on a local BJP member who was known for his exposes of other politicians. And when they ran that, in a very little time, the government tried to shut them down. They went to the courts. The court said there is no case to shut them down, and it's reinstated them. But now, only a couple of days ago, the government has shut them down on the very vague premise that their licensing was not in order or something to that effect. So these, along with the fact that there is no viable business model, you also have this whole problem of these laws that are now have been deployed to shut down all the pesky little independent media that exist. So if as and when these are actually these come to fruition and they become laws, then the government literally, if it wants to, it can do anything that they can. All of us can be shut down.
But the only thing is today, like, I don't think you, I mean, if you even don't look at the new laws or whatever, but every case that has been mounted against, say, journalists or activists, also anti government activists, you'd see a clear, like, for example, one journalist who was on his way to report on a rape that had happened in Uttar Pradesh, uh, and he was put in jail for 800 days almost. He was behind bars, and the case was a terror charge. And if you read the charge sheet, it's just a thought crime, that he was on his way to create some sort of a trouble. So what I'm saying is, actually, you don't even need laws anymore. You've had enough instances now where you can put someone behind bars on terror charges. And once you have a terror charge slapped on you, you'll be behind bars for 3 years minimum, 2 years. And the crime is often that they're trying to destabilize India. They're trying to, create some sort of a mayhem. Really colonial era, sedition kind of laws that the British used on Indians, those still exist and that's being weaponized.
Right, right, right. But also going back to TV that we were talking about, I was thinking about there's been an exodus of journalists, anchors, also from TV to YouTube now. So, but do you think like that is an sustainable alternative?
Let's not forget that it's not just anchors that make a television news channel or a news entity. It's often reporters who do groundwork. And if they don't find the space to do what they want to do, which is just ground reporting, basic, 101 fact gathering, they can't just start a YouTube channel and start doing, journalism on YouTube, because they have to pay bills, you need salaries, you need infrastructure. So I don't think YouTube is a response to shrinking space in mainstream media. I mean, it's at least not a healthy one. Of course, a lot of journalists have moved on, anchors have moved on, and they're doing great job. But that's really, I don't think that can really counter the sheer size at which mainstream media operates. And what is that reporting? Like, what does a reporter do when you join an organization? And that is one of the reasons why we're seeing such a creeping sort of self censorship, because we've always had business interests. We've always had businessmen own media, or we've had media men have business interests, because of which they always have to be in the good books of the government. So Adani is one case, but it's really, we've always had that. And before Adani, there were, other business entities that kind of had interest in NGT. So I think business interests have always been an issue.
Right, but it also put like spotlight on like our business and revenue models in the media. Are there any alternatives to that, or to like revenue sources or business models?
No business model, I think, has really succeeded as far as the independent media goes. There are a lot of really good efforts, Manisha's News Laundry being one of them, and there are a few others as well. But I don't. But none of them, as she said, can match the size and heft of the mainstream media. We are literally very minuscule compared to the giants that exist in television and the print media and the online media. They have vast resources, um, um, millions and billions of dollars from advertising and revenues, but none of those revenues are actually deployed towards doing the kind of journalism that they should be doing. As far as business models go, I think we are all struggling to figure out what business model works. But I think no one has really cracked that, and I don't think it's going to be anytime soon.
So News Laundry has been around since 2012, and we've been very clear that what we want to do is have a completely subscription reader driven enterprise. We've managed to survive so long completely through subscriptions without any government or corporate advertising. And because we're very clear that if news is going to be heavily dependent on governments and corporations, we are going to go down that road of having to side with someone or the other at some point. It's very difficult to stay independent. So we've managed to do that completely subscription driven. However, we're a small team. We don't need to have that big, newspaper team. small but impactful nonetheless. We've been able to cover a lot of things, do ground reportage, thanks to the kind of subscription that we've managed to garner over the past few years, and also a lot of literacy, media literacy that we engage in, telling people, because paying for news is very new in India. People don't get why you should do that. So we've also invested a lot of time explaining to people why it's important for them to take the control back in their hand. If you don't want news that serves governments or corporations, then and you want news to serve you, then you have to pay a little bit for it, because journalism is expensive. It's not a cheap thing to do. But so, from the subscription point of view, I'm very optimistic. I think a lot of people are recognizing why it's important to pay for news. I think sheer volumes in India means that we don't have to have very expensive subscriptions, but if we can reach to enough people, you can have a sustainable operation, which we've managed to do. Where the issues come in is that, and I'm talking about everyone, that look, if you're even a digital news organization, you want investors coming in. Today you're in that space where, even if people believe in you and support you, I'm talking about businesses, investors, they may not necessarily want to be seen around you because you're seen as anti-government. And that is one huge issue that a lot of people in digital news organizations have had to face, that privately we support you, we really like your work, but we don't want to be on your cap table, we don't want to be seen around you, because that could mean government action on my business, because I'm supporting you who's supposed to be anti-government. And that's a lot of load, that's a lot of pressure for digital organizations, simply in terms of how do you raise money, how do you get investors on board. And that is unfortunate, that is the sad reality. And you see that, in multiple conversations that you'll have with people in the business, especially in digital media, this is huge concern. And of course, with mainstream, it's clear that you go with where the wind is blowing, and that's how you ensure the money keeps coming in.
But since you both run independent, news organizations, is there like a safety hygiene that you follow? Things to keep in mind, given the challenges.
One of our previous founders used to joke that that you're only out of jail because no one wants you in jail. So in India, the laws are such that if they want to put you behind the bars for something, no matter how safe or whatever you do, there'll be some loophole or something or the other that they can. Like I said, there've been journalists in jail for 800 days for a thought crime, for apparently wanting to go somewhere to create terror. That was literally why he was in jail for 800 days. So there's some level of, of course, because we're dealing with sources, we're a journalistic organization, we do the usual of, clearing up, using safe apps and stuff like that. Um, but beyond that, I mean, no, not there's. I don't know how you can really be safe in this environment, because literally anything can be used against you. So you don't want to end up being too paranoid also, that you're just constantly worried about, what's going to happen to you. So you won't be able to do your job if you're too worried. But the basics, of course, using a safe, channel to communicate with your sources, um, stuff like that. And having good accounts, making sure your accounts are well taken care of.
Yeah, we spend a lot of our limited resources on having a very good chartered accountant. And as Manisha said, if they won't have to come after you, they will. But if this goes to a court of law, then there should not be legal trouble that you should get into. So our accounts are as clean as they can be. They're audited. Our chartered accountant is very, very particular. For example, we don't even take grants. We cannot. He doesn't allow us to even take grants from anyone else. Yeah, strict compliance with the laws of the land, and we just make sure we don't violate them. Again, to re-emphasize, none of this means that they cannot come after you. If they want to, they will. But really, beyond a point, you just have to do what you are doing and keep doing it, because otherwise, you shouldn't be in this business. You should. It's best that you get out of here. And many have done that, and I can't say that the thought has not crossed my mind, where I say that, would it not be easier to just retire at this point of time? I always think that my father, at this age, he was a government servant, a police officer actually, and this was the age for him to retire. So if I was a government servant, I would have retired by now. And I wonder sometimes, perhaps would it not have been easier to simply retire? But no, it's not what we want to do.
Not that we also don't want you to go. But moving on, I was also thinking about international reporting. I think the space for that also in India I see is kind of decreasing. Also because I think BBC, the raids or the surveys happened in their offices too after the documentary. I think in general, I think international reporters are also being very careful. We spoke about how the NYT is occasionally bashed, and is called anti-India. So, but in general, like, what is your sense about international reporting that's happening on India? Like, is it covering the gaps, or is it not doing a good job?
BBC is pretty much an Indian operation. I mean, they cover in languages. They do a lot of ground reporting. So it's not like an NYT where a reporter is stationed here. And look, the constraints with being an NYT or Washington Post reporter in India is that you're constantly writing for an audience that doesn't really know India or need not care about India on a daily basis. So, a lot of the reporting has to be superfluous. Not many of the big things that we think big will not make it to, NYT WOPO. So again, like I said, it's not a you can't rely on foreign media because your own home media is not doing a good job. Having said that, I think Washington Post, of late, to my mind at least, has been doing some stellar investigative reporting that really mainstream news should be doing on troll armies that have links to the current government, on pressures on filmmakers and movie makers in Bombay, censorship that's creeping in because of the current government, Pegasus, the spyware being planted. So I think they're doing an interesting, yeah, I mean, you could say that they're picking up things that mainstream Indian news is not picking up. But it's not enough, of course.
So that was a good example, the Washington Post, of the kind of reporting on India that the foreign media should be doing. There is another example, of course, of people who could be doing much more and simply will not do it. For example, The Economist, who largely has bought into the government view of how the country, society, and politics is unfolding. Criticism is completely mild, and in fact, I have read quite a lot of the recent coverage. They've done a cover story on India, indeed, where there was only mildly a reference to this democratic downturn in India. And I know for a fact, for some, I won't say many, but for some that I know, foreign media, this is also a question of access. That they feel the pressure as much as we do, perhaps less, of course. But there is a question of access because the moment they are watched and monitored now, so the moment they write something that is overly critical, they know that they are going to be not harassed like we are, but certainly, they find their questions asked from them of the government officers whom they have to deal with, etc. And I've heard this from the correspondents themselves. So they feel that pressure as well. And given that, there are some media definitely who are a little anxious to tone down critical coverage of the government. Um, Primarily because that so that they can get and continue to have access to government, because this government is very clear that if if you are overly critical, etc., we will simply cut off access to you.
So another thing to think about is that the India-US relationships have been very close over the last 2 years at least. So I think even with foreign correspondents who are stationed in different countries, I wonder if it's tricky for them also, because I think there's a very clear direction that the US government is taking with how it wants to deal with Modi, how it wants to deal with India. And I wonder if that, kind of has pressures on journalists in India reporting on India.
It tends to. I think it certainly tends to have that pressure. I think it certainly, from the few that I know, it certainly tends to have that pressure because whether you like it or not, and however democratic and free the Western media have been, the fact is they have always, in large measure, aligned with the national interests of those governments. We have seen that. We have seen that from the times of the Iraq War. We are seeing that now in stark measure when it comes to what's happening in Gaza, etc. So whether consciously or unconsciously, there definitely has been an aligning with a national interest. And the fact that India has become a counterweight to China, or is regarded as such, certainly tends to make its way into some of the coverage that I've seen. And I have to tell you that whenever I often sometimes I'm asked to come and talk to some foreign envoys, etc. And whenever I talk to them, I just tell them now that I really don't know what the point is of talking to you, because you may agree with me and you may say yes, snicker over it and say, yeah, things are really bad in India, etc. But your governments are still going to sell us arms, do business with us, etc., because that is where your interests lie, and that is fine. National interest is paramount to diplomats, etc. But if journalists start unconsciously or consciously aligning themselves with their country's interest, then that is a problem. And I think we are seeing that specifically in some measure, at least. And I have to say, there are honorable exceptions. There are quite a few honorable exceptions, and as Manisha said, the Washington Post is a very good exception. But uh, they also find it very difficult, I think, to bear the kind of pressure that they feel.
Right. But what do you think are the kind of, say, events or people or issues that are just not getting covered, in the country and they should be?
Well, there's plenty. I mean, yeah, of course. One is that the sole agenda every day is to kind of run down the opposition um, in a very systematic way. So that is one kind of debate. But you look at large events like Manipur, a state which has been embroiled in ethnic violence since May last year. You've had so many people dead, a state completely divided along ethnic lines. Just yesterday, I think 4 people were killed again. So, state in constant turmoil. Does not That news did not make it to prime time. May have been a ticker, but it was not prime time news. Or yeah, when you had um some of the top wrestling champions in India protest against the chief of the wrestling federation for sexual harassment, and this person is very important to the current government. You had that news ignored for quite a bit till it became difficult for them to do that. And then when the news was picked up, it was questioning the wrestlers that why are they protesting? Whose payrolls are they on? Is it a political protest and stuff like that?
There are lots of things that the government, that the media do not pick up at all. I mean, I don't know where to begin. But I think one of the most obvious things, whether now the Indian media or the foreign media that's happening in India, is the complete collapse of any kind of rule of law in a place like Jammu and Kashmir, where we know that journalism has completely fallen apart. We carry a lot of stories from Kashmir, but over the last 3 years, the reporters who have been reporting for us gradually have disappeared because they've all faced either criminal cases or they faced harassing raids. There are random raids in the middle of the night to shake up their house, thrash their house, etc. Even for stories that would have been routine, for example, we have reporters who are saying, please don't run our bylines. We will write the story, but don't run our bylines. There's been endless harassment. There have been arrests that have been prevented. Many have been detained under preventive detention laws. And that has completely what is happening in Jammu and Kashmir, where at this point of time, there are hundreds, if not, we don't really know, but if not a couple of thousands of people detained under what the state has a very, well, not state, is now a union territory, has very draconian preventive detention law under which you can be locked up for 2 years without bail or access to a lawyer. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have been locked up. They have been distributed to jails across India. And if you read the Indian papers, for example, this is not an issue at all, and it doesn't occur because it's just not reported. It's simple as that. All these things have been completely scrubbed, and there is no democracy as we know that exists in Kashmir anymore. And as Manisha said, Manipur is another stark example, a state where the state has collapsed, the government has collapsed, and the ethnic cleansing has been evident. There are armed gangs roaming around. There are gun battles every night virtually. But none of this is making it to the mainstream media. If you switch on the television, none of this is there. None of this is evident. So there's just few examples, but there's lots like this that just don't get covered.
The one question that I had for you, and I think it could be hard to choose, but what would be the most alarming incident with regards to media freedom or just in general journalism and what journalists and journalism has been facing in India? Like, what would be the most alarming in the recent past, according to you? Like something that really like was shocking from all of the things that we've discussed.
To me, it's been the arrest and imprisonment of Fahad Shah, who was the editor of the Kashmir Wala, which was the last independent website in Kashmir. He had some cases against him, etc. He had been detained often on the roadside detentions, etc. But he's always let free. And then one day he was arrested. There were multiple cases filed against him. He got bail in all those cases, at least on 3 occasions, if I remember right. And finally, but the government simply would not release him. And finally, they arrested him under this preventive detention law and just bunged him into jail. He was been in jail for more than 2 years. And finally, when it went to the Jammu and Kashmir High Court, the High Court said what other courts had been saying, that there is no case, there is no criminality, there is nothing. He has to be free. And he was set free. But in the time that he was there, the government then arbitrarily shut down his website, which was limping along, was arbitrarily shut down. There was nothing. It was just shut down. It was blocked entirely. And that, I think, is a template for what can easily happen to the rest of the media in India. We always think that, oh, this has happened in Kashmir, that's different. But it's not, because we are seeing elements of that so-called Kashmir model have now trickled down into the mainstream Indian polity. And to me, was clearly the most shocking example. We spoke to him after he came out. He's, well, quite a broken man, and I don't think he's going to get back to journalism in a hurry.
No, I remember reading that interview and it was very heartbreaking. I think the things he had to say or things he said, I would not talk about at all. Yeah, Manisha, do you have anything like something that really?
So I watch so many shocking things every day that okay, I think two things to me I still marvel at, even though I'm so used to it now, is one, this complete craven acceptance by mainstream journalists that you have a prime minister who will not give press conferences. It's been 10 years. We have accepted it, it's lauded, it's seen as this masterstroke strategy that he doesn't even talk to the press. It's some kind of a macho thing to do. It's really pathetic that the largest democracy in the world has accepted this. I think the younger generation, if you talk to some of the new reporters who come into the newsroom, they're shocked when they see previous press conferences, like, oh, this used to happen. Like, because I showed them recently Manmohan Singh's last press conference from 10 years ago, and they were like, really? This used to happen? So that complete wiping off and people cheering it. And, it's not about, okay, you could be a critic of the government, you could even, I'm saying, be pro government, okay, you've taken a side. But the levels of sycophancy that you witness every day on television news, uh, say G20, for example, is one thing to host it well, to come out with a statement, big win for Indian diplomacy, but quite another to portray this as this big victory. If you talk to most Indians today, they'll think that G20 came to India because of Modi, that Modi is the reason why G20 happened in India. There'll be no understanding it's a rotating presidency. We would have had it irrespective of whoever the prime minister was. Just complete glorification day in and day out of. I mean, I think it's almost like he's at that mythical cult level. If you watch news and if that's what you consume, it's not even a politician anymore. It's just above politics. I think the stature of media, and that's primarily because of the way the media has been able to do it. The second thing that appalls me is to witness this, concentrated hate being spitted out every night across television news channels. We have a situation where a crime occurs and you have anchors jumping to see what the religion of the accused is. So if it's a rape case and if it's a Muslim man, they jump on it and forget the countless cases just to point out at that, how Muslims are bad and they're dangerous and what they do to your women. And other cases would be completely, so women's safety is only an issue when there's a criminal who's Muslim. So that kind of concentrated targeting of minorities is very scary. It's appalling to watch it on a day in and day out basis. And it's very scary to think of the ramifications. You're going to create a population that's going to be completely immune to injustices, already is very immune to injustices being meted out on minorities. So that So it was very appalling to watch.
So, what do you think? Like ahead of the elections, what is the mood like? Like, what are your expectations? I think this next few months are going to be even more busy, and I don't know what it has in store.
Yeah, well, we're all geared up. We're going to be hitting the ground. We During the elections, we put a lot of emphasis on ground reporting. So yeah, we're excited about that. I think that look, it's. I don't think it's productive to get too cynical or depressed about what's happening. Yeah, it's hard. I think it's harder for journalists than ever before. But I think hard times also make you innovate, make you think about how you can communicate with your audience in a different way, make you think about how you can reach out to people through your journalism. So in a newsroom, that has the ability, that's multimedia, that can use different mediums. It's also exciting times to just think of how you can reinvent yourself, in the current times. So I'm still quite optimistic, despite everything, all the bleak picture that we've given you over the past one.
I agree with that. Optimism I'm very optimistic as well. One reason for that is because we work with um, with a whole lot of fine young reporters, so very idealistic, who earn a fraction of the money we used to earn actually when we were at their stage of their careers. And it's just exhilarating and heartwarming and rewarding to work with people like that. And as long as they're doing the hard work out there, we must provide the overall support structure that we can to all of them. So whatever happens, we are not going to do the best we can, and we're definitely not going to go quietly into the night.
This has been The Lead by New Lines magazine. I want to thank our guests, Manisha Pande and Samar Halarnkar, for joining us. You can find Manisha on X at Mansha Pande and Samar at Samar11. This week's episode was produced by Finba Anderson and hosted by me, Surbhi Gupta. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app and visit our website, newlinesmag.com. Please rate us in your favorite podcast app. It really helps us grow a bigger audience. See you next week.